Gandalf stood before the door of Orthanc and beat on it with his staff. It rang with a hollow sound. "Saruman! Saruman!" he cried in a loud, commanding voice. "Saruman, come forth!" For some time there was no answer. At last the window above the door was unbarred, but no figure could be seen at its dark opening. "Who is it?" said a voice. "What do you wish?" Theoden started. "I know that voice," he said, "and I curse the day when I first listened to it." "Go and fetch Saruman, since you have become his footman, Grima Wormtongue," said Gandalf, "and do not waste our time." The window closed. They waited. Suddenly another voice spoke, low and melodious, its very sound an enchantment. Those who listened unwarily to that voice could seldom report the words that they heard, and if they did, they wondered, for little power remained in them. Mostly they remembered only that it was a delight to hear the voice speaking. All that it said seemed wise and reasonable, and desire awoke in them by swift agreement to seem wise themselves. When others spoke, they seemed harsh and uncouth by contrast, and if they gainsaid the voice, anger was kindled in the hearts of those under the spell. For some, the spell lasted only while the voice spoke to them, and when it spoke to another, they smiled, as men do who see through a juggler's trick, while others gape at it. For many, the sound of the voice alone was enough to hold them enthralled, but for those whom it conquered, the spell endured when they were far away, and ever they heard that soft voice whispering and urging them. But none were unmoved. None rejected its pleas and its commands without an effort of mind and will, so long as its master had control of it. "Well," it said now with gentle question, "why must you disturb my rest? Will you give me no peace at all by night or day?" Its tone was that of a kindly heart aggrieved by injuries undeserved. They looked up, astonished, for they had heard no sound of his coming, and they saw a figure standing at the rail, looking down upon them, an old man, swathed in a great cloak, the color of which was not easy to tell, for it changed if they moved their eyes or if he stirred. His face was long, with a high forehead. He had deep, darkling eyes, hard to fathom, though the look that they now bore was grave and benevolent, and a little weary. His hair and beard were white, but strands of black still showed about his lips and ears. "Like, and yet unlike," muttered Gimli. Welcome. I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. I'm recording today on January 6th, 2021, and so I thought, absolutely, we have to talk about the spell of words. There's been a bit of a break between episode 19 and episode 20 in my recording history, in that I spent 6 weeks not recording Forge of Tolkien videos, but listening to Owen on his live stream, and of course I understand now how much he talks about spells. So I thought on this day of spells and happenings in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, we might talk about enchantment and voices and how they work. So we have this very resonant scene where Gandalf and Theoden and Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli and Merry and Pippin are there at the foot of the Tower of Orthanc, and Gandalf has just called Saruman to come forth, and he's shown up on his balcony. So we say this is Saruman's balcony scene, and it's a very interesting scene because, of course, Tolkien is here trying to show you, in fact, the power that Saruman truly wields, which is his voice. The chapter is called The Voice of Saruman, and I'd like to sort of unpack this in this episode. First, what kind of voice was it? Who is Saruman, and why does Tolkien understand him having the power that he does, and what kind of power is it exactly that brings people under the spell of this enchanting voice? As a corollary to that, of course, how does Tolkien understand Saruman's spell to work, and what does Tolkien mean by the spell, that this voice brings them under. I mean, that everyone who hears Saruman's voice is brought under the spell, and how are they able, if at all, to resist it, and what would that mean? And then I'd like to talk about Saruman himself as a character and what Tolkien is trying to show us through Saruman's own story. And as usual, these things will probably fold into each other as I'm talking, but those are the things that I'd like to talk about. What kind of voice is Tolkien imagining Saruman wielding? How is it working, and who is Saruman in this story? Well, those of you well versed in the lore will, of course, have read the appendices, and you'll know a little bit more about Saruman and Gandalf, of course, because this is what's interesting about this particular encounter between Gandalf and Saruman, is that they are speaking as, well, something. I mean, equals may be the word, peers, but they are different kinds of characters from everyone else in the Lord of the Rings, other than, interestingly, Radagast. Well, of course, who were they, right? And as I said, those of you schooled in the lore will know, okay, say they're wizards, right? That Saruman and Gandalf are wizards. Well, what does that mean? What does Tolkien mean it to mean? And he explains in the Tale of Years, in the chronology, Appendix B, that they sort of just appear in Middle-earth, right? I'm also enjoying the fact that I'm recording this on the Feast of the Epiphany, when the three wise men somehow show up and ask to be directed to where the baby it is born to be king is there with his parents, right? And I hope you know that story as well. And it's interesting that the way Tolkien has these wizards, which are, obviously wise men of some sort, possibly magicians. What are they? They simply appear, right? He says into the Third Age, so after the fall of Sauron and Isildur's taking the One Ring, we have the end of the Second Age. The Third Age is 1,000 years into it, right? And in fact, we don't have that many events in those first 1,000 years, except for the birth of Arwen in 241. But around the year 1100, in the Third Age, the Istari, or wizards, appeared in Middle-earth, right? And it's interesting that Tolkien doesn't really give them. He likes sort of leaving it indefinite, even how they show up. We do know that Círdan, the shipwright, recognizes Gandalf when Gandalf arrives and gives him the elven ring that Círdan has been keeping. He gives him the ring of fire and says that with it you may rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill. But Círdan himself prefers to stay with the sea. So there's a suggestion, of course, that they came somehow into port, but it's not saying. It's simply it was afterwards that they came out of the far west on ships. They flew, who knows, right? What's interesting, of course, is they are embodied, and this is going to be very important for Saruman's story, because they take the form of men, they take the shape of men, but they never grow up, right? So they don't, on this day of Epiphany, on this day of appearances, they simply appear. They aren't born. They when they arrive, they seem old already, and age only slowly. Why do they age at all? That's a little unclear. It's like they're sort of always old men. They're never born, and they just show up. And it says, okay, that they came out of the far west, which, of course, in Tolkien's Legendarium, is coming out of the land of the blessed. But it's again, it's not exactly clear how they journey, where they come from. I mean, Numenor has fallen in the west already, so who are these Istari? They're messengers sent to contest the power of Sauron and to unite all those who had the will to resist him. But they were forbidden to match his power with power, or to seek to dominate elves or men by force and fear. which technically makes them angels. Right, and that's what's interesting about it. And Tolkien explains that in one of his letters. He talks, as usual, setting himself up every so often, that they're not incarnations, although they're embodied, right? They're not incarnations of God. They're not meant to be, in fact, themselves divine, in the sense that Christ is, right? An embodiment of the Creator, the Word. One day we're going to talk theology fully in these episodes, but here we're sort of playing with this background problem that Tolkien has created for us, by way of wanting to have wizards, right? He has Gandalf in The Hobbit, of course, and it's interesting the kind of guide that Gandalf is in The Hobbit. He shows up, sets Bilbo off on his journey and on his adventure, and then leaves Bilbo and the dwarves right when they're about to go into the forest, and says, I have other business. And then he shows up later saying, oh yeah, I finished my So exactly how much help these wizards are, it's interesting because they don't show up and take over and win the battles for everyone, right? They are meant to come simply as, well, what? And in this letter, this is letter 181, writing to Michael Straight, answering a number of questions about the characters in The Lord of the Rings, and explains explicitly there is no embodiment of the Creator anywhere in this story or mythology. Gandalf is a created person, though possibly a spirit that existed before in the physical world, which suggests that the embodied Istari were somehow there with the Ainur, not just the Valar, right? They come out of the far west, but it sounds like if they existed before, possibly a spirit that existed before in the physical world. It's a little unclear. It's like, are they from before the embodiment of Arda, or are they simply embodied in Arda? Tolkien couldn't really make his mind up, because he wanted to have them as this incarnate spirit sent as a messenger, like an angel, but without license, without permission to interfere in the story. But they still kind of do, right? Okay, so but how do they interfere in the story, and exactly what kinds of interference are they capable of? That's one of the curious questions. So Gandalf, his function as a wizard is an angelos, or messenger from the Valar, or rulers, right? So he's technically an angel, which makes Saruman also technically an angel, which means this conversation between Gandalf and Saruman at Orthanc is a conversation between two angels, which is interesting, right? His function, to assist the rational creatures of Middle-earth to resist Sauron, a power too great for them unaided. So Sauron has been banished, the ring has been taken, and yet, almost as if the Valar know that the rational creatures are going to need help, the Istari show up around 1,000. Because the shadow has fallen on Greenwood and Mirkwood, and so it seems as if Sauron, something's happening, right? It's like that's in the tale of, in Appendix B, we have in 1050, Hayar-Mendasil conquers the Harad. Gondor reaches the height of its power. About this time, a shadow falls on Greenwood, and men begin to call it Mirkwood. The Perianath, those are the hobbits, are first mentioned in the records with the coming of the Harfoots to Eriador. And about 50 years later, the Valar never seem to work very swiftly. The wise, the Istari and the chief Eldar, discover that an evil power has made a stronghold at Dol Guldur. It is thought to be one of the Nazgul. So you have the Istari show, the something dark appears in Mirkwood, and it appears in Greenwood, takes over and makes it Mirkwood, and the Istari show up, presumably sent by the Valar, as messengers to help, and yet it's sort of unclear exactly what they're going to have to help against, with the premise that the power that Gandalf and Saruman and the other Istari, we'll find out how many there are in a second, have, is to assist the rational creatures. So they're just going to be assisting because the fear is, or the concern is of the Valar, that the rational creatures, the men and the hobbits and the elves and the dwarves and the eagles, I guess, don't have the power on their own to resist Sauron. But he says, but since in the view of this tale and mythology, power, when it dominates or seeks to dominate other wills and minds, except by the assent of their reason, is evil, these wizards were incarnated in the life forms of Middle-earth, and so suffered the pains both of mind and body. So Tolkien says, in my story, power is evil when it seeks to dominate other wills. So the wizards are like shackled or tamed a bit, incarnated so that they in fact suffer the same kinds of things all of the other embodied rational creatures do. They were also, for the same reason, thus involved in the peril of the incarnate, the possibility of fall, of sin, if you will. Now, that's interesting because, of course, if they're angels, we know angels could fall too. In the Christian mythology, Lucifer was the great angel of light and fell and becomes Satan, the enemy, the adversary, and Sauron is and isn't Satan. He's definitely the adversary, but of course Sauron, interestingly, like Gandalf and Saruman, is himself one of these not quite Valar, right? Because Sauron served Morgoth, and it's only after Morgoth's fall that Sauron rises. So in fact, this is a great angelic battle. If you think Gandalf and Saruman are sent to help the rational creatures deal with Sauron, but without giving them power to enslave, right? And Tolkien is associating the power of the problem of sin with incarnation here. The chief form of this would take with them would be impatience, leading to the desire to force others to do their own good ends, and so inevitably at last to mere desire to make their own wills effective by any means. By any means. That's a phrase that resonates a lot right now. To this evil, Saruman succumbed, Gandalf did not. Okay, so we're going to see the conversation at Orthanc play out in the problem of coercion of will and how that works, and what exactly, therefore, does that mean Saruman's voice is, right? What kind of power does he have? But the situation became so much the worse by the fall of Saruman that the good were obliged to greater effort and sacrifice. Because Saruman falls, Gandalf has to go through something further. Thus Gandalf faced and suffered death and came back, or was sent back, as he says, with enhanced power. So when Gandalf falls fighting the Balrog and he returns in a very interesting capacity, and as Tolkien is reasoning out for himself now, it's saying, well, Gandalf needed to be boosted because Saruman had fallen. But though one may be in this reminded of the Gospels, it is not really the same thing at all. The usual sort of, okay, fine, the incarnation of God is an infinitely greater thing than anything I would dare to write. Here, okay, so this is not a story about Christ, even though we're dealing this on the Feast of the Epiphany and the revelation. It's also the day of his baptism. If I got that right, I've got my feast all mixed up. Baptism is his circumcision is on the first, and this is the baptism. Here I am only concerned with death as a part of the nature, physical and spiritual, of man, and with hope without guarantees. Okay, so we have this setup premising that they're angels, they're sent to assist the rational creatures, and they are limited, one, by being incarnate, and two, in fact, by their office, right? So they have many powers of mind and hand, but they're not. This is tricky. It's like, could Saruman have done more than he did? Right? And we think about how limited or not is he. But Gandalf, when he comes back, is then able to do things. For example, like fight against the wraiths, right? But Gandalf never goes up directly against Sauron in battle, right? There's no boss fight between Gandalf and Sauron. So exactly the level of power that they're given is interesting. And it's also interesting. It's like Tolkien is saying, I didn't want this to be a Christ story, so they can't just come and save everyone. But if you think about the way Gandalf's power is in fact enhanced, he dies and comes back to life. He's sent back incarnate after he battles the Balrog and falls, which could be a kind of Christ-like battling of, who knows, right? And that's one, I think that, as always, is one of the great powers of Tolkien storytelling, that he leaves you wrestling with the story rather than being able to say, yeah, right, that's Christ and that's Satan, and no, right? It's all and the technical understanding of this you need to get to is it's parable, right? It's teaching through the story. Wisdom comes through unpacking the stories, not just, from plugging in, sort of pieces in an equation, right? And that one forbears, right? I think this is the kind of storytelling and unpacking that I think Owen is doing with you, which is why it's so valuable. You get yourself in that story and then have to wrestle with it and figure it out, so that it's not simply these one-to-one allegories, right? So we're not saying Gandalf is Christ-like, except we are, because he's incarnate and returns empowered, but they're angels, which is kind of a Christ-like image, because Christ is in some respects considered the great angel of Israel, which is complicated and probably would take a whole nother video to explain. You need to be inside the story to appreciate the problems that all of these different characters are giving you, right? Okay, so that's sort of what kind of being is Saruman, and Gandalf being the sort of foil to Saruman's fall, because Gandalf is lifted up. How many were there, and does that matter? Well, at one point Tolkien says they reveal their true names only to a few, but use such names as were given to them. And there's that famous passage where Gandalf talks about the many names that he was called, although Faramir is quoting Gandalf here. Many are my names in many countries, he said. This is Faramir quoting Gandalf, right? Mithrandir among the elves, Tharkun to the dwarves, Olorin I was in my youth in the west that is forgotten. But they didn't have youth, right? So that's a little confusing. But in the south, in Canus, in the north, Gandalf to the east, I go not. So exactly what their names are supposed to mean. Their names are, as names are typically in Tolkien, references to their function in the story, right? The two highest of this order, of whom it was said there were 5, although elsewhere we have here just the Lord of the Rings, right? But also in Unfinished Tales, there's a little chapter called the Istari, which seems to suggest that there could have been more of them. He fills it out a little bit, saying wizard is a translation of Kinya Istar, Sindran Ithron, one of the members of an order, as they called it, claiming to possess and exhibiting imminent knowledge of the history and nature of the world. The translation, though suitable in its relation to wise and other ancient words of knowing, similar to that of Istar and Kinya, is not perhaps happy, since the Harin Istarian, or order of wizards, was quite distinct from the wizards and magicians of later legend. Okay, so we might talk about them as wizards, but they're not really. Yet again, Tolkien, it's like with elves or ents or orcs, right? He's always wanting to have his character types distinct in the story world, and saying, now, yes, we have memories or traditions of this kind of being, but these were different. They belonged solely to the Third Age and then departed. And none save maybe Elrond, Círdan, and Galadriel discovered of what kind they were or whence they came. So nobody knows. Let's leave them shrouded in mystery. Again, because Tolkien doesn't want to make anything so definite as to bring it down, right? Among men, they were supposed at first by those that had dealings with them to be men who had acquired lore and arts by long and secret study. They first appeared in Middle-earth about the year 1000 of the Third Age, but for long they went about in simple guise, as it were, of men already old in years, but hale in body, travellers and wanderers, gaining knowledge of Middle-earth and all that dwelt therein, but revealing to none their powers and purposes. But as the shadow became more active, they became more active. And he said, this is what I was looking for. Of this order, the number is unknown, right? So there's numbers of them. And although in the appendix to the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien says there were 5 of them, and that's what everybody knows, right? There's Gandalf and Saruman, and then there's Radagast, the Tamer of Beasts, right? And the 2 blue ones, which everybody always says, ooh, who are they? The blue wizards. In my Tolkien course, I've had a number of people do excellent stories on it's like, the blue wizards go east with Saruman, but they never come back, right? And so exactly who are they? We don't know, right? They're just listed. But late in this note, probably written around the time the Lord of the Rings was published, we don't know how many there were. It's those of the north that we know there were 5, right? So the first to come was one of noble mien and bearing, with raven hair and a fair voice, and he was clad in white. Great skill he had in works of hand, and was regarded by well nigh all, even by the elders, the head of the order. So that's Saruman. Others there were also 2 clad in sea blue, and one in earthen brown. And last came one who seemed the least, less tall than the others, and in looks more aged, grey-haired and grey-clad, and leaning on a staff. And that's of course playing off of Gandalf. The name comes from the Volushpa with the list of dwarves, and in the Volushpa, the Old Norse Volushpa, it's just it's a dwarf name. Gandalf is a dwarf name, but it kind of means staff elf. So Gandalf always has his staff because it's embedded in the name that Tolkien lifted out of the Volushpa. Círdan, from their first meeting at the Grey Havens, divined in him the greatest spirit and the wisest, and he gives him Narya, the red ring. Now, so there are 5 in the north. There are possibly more. It's like, how many angels are there? It's interesting that in the scriptures, there's only a few angels named: Michael and Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel is usually listed as the 4th. But you usually think of angels are Michael and Gabriel, and Raphael is in Tobit, right? So it's a little vague with the premise that there could have been more, but we don't really know how many. But unlike angels in Christian mythology, they're definitely bodied, right? They're incarnate, which does make it, if they're embodied angels, what does that make them? The 2 highest of this order were called by the elder Curanir, the man of skill, right? And that's it's very interesting that Saruman's primary characteristic is of skill and craftiness of mind and hand, right? And you realize that those are the 2 things that Saruman does, right? He has crafty words, and of course what he makes at Orthanc is all that industry, right? And Mithrandir, the Grey Pilgrim, but then they're quote not Curanir and Mithrandir, but Saruman and Gandalf. Curanir journeyed often into the east, but dwelt at last in Isengard. Now consider what that means. Is it with the Magi, it's interesting. They come from the east, which means they saw the star in the west. And I'm thinking, of course, about our great, December 21st, 2020 conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, which last seen in 1226, which is an interesting date because it's the year St. Francis of Assisi died, and St. Francis is famous for having, in 1223, set up the manger at Greccio, right, as a devotional memorial of the Nativity. I could certainly also go into that. There's an excellent book by Mary Dizon on the Christ child in medieval stories, and Francis figures in that. It's like, is there a baby in the manger? Did he use the host? We're not really sure. The point being, the last time the star, the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, was seen on Earth. If it's happening elsewhere, we don't know. It was back in the Middle Ages, right? And that star, it's not that conjunction. It's presumably the three planet conjunction that would make the star that the wise men saw. They come from the east, and they must travel therefore west to get to it, right? So the star is actually in the west, which is where the Saturn and Jupiter conjunction was last month, right? December 26th. That Saruman and the two blue wizards go to the east, and then Saruman returns west, but the other wizards stay there. We don't know what happened to them. Mithrandir, however, closest to the Eldar, wanders mostly in the west and maintains himself as a pilgrim. Now, I'm fascinated that these are the characteristics that Tolkien emphasizes about Saruman and Gandalf. That Saruman is man of skill, and Gandalf is a pilgrim, right? Now, here, Tolkien cannot be unaffected by medieval understandings of our purpose in life, right? That we live as viatores, right? Wanderers in this life. We don't actually belong fully to this earth, although it was made for us and we live here, but we have, as human beings, a home elsewhere towards which we're tending, and that it's in certain respects, and I know Vox has talked about this a lot, whether Owen has talked about it, I'm not quite sure, but that we're maybe he has, right, that in this life we're being tested by the challenges that being embodied and mortal give us, and that in that respect we don't belong to the powers of this world, right? We are pilgrims, right? So Gandalf, as Mithrandir, as the Grey Pilgrim, he's in a sense they're all Christian figures, so you get there, but it's a very interesting medieval image to have of Gandalf as the wanderer, the one, his other attribute, of course, being the staff that lights up, right? So he bears light into the darkness. He wanders and is gray in his raiment, whereas Saruman is initially white, and he is seen by Círdan when he first arrives as the one who can rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill. Now that rekindling of hearts that he is going to encourage, he's going to give strength by way of passion and love. The rekindling imagery is very, very interesting and powerful. So while Gandalf never establishes himself with any particular residence, Saruman sets himself up at Isengard. Okay, so now we're here in the place where we meet Saruman in the story, and we meet Saruman in the story in person, right, when he's basically trapped Gandalf by way of a message that he sent through Radagast. And that is, you say, what kind of power do the wizards have? Gandalf seems to have a certain, facility with fireworks and lightning and kindling magic, as Círdan recognized, that he has the ring of fire, and so he's able to spark. But exactly what kind of power do they have over the other creatures, and what kind of power do they have in relationship to each other? Well, in order for Saruman to get Gandalf to show up, he had to trick him, right? So that's starting to give you, and he had to send a message through Radagast, who, Radagast finds Radagast finds Gandalf and tells him that the enemy, it's like, he'd been seeking him, right? Gandalf, he cried, I was seeking you. All I knew was that you might be found in a wild region with the uncouth name of Shire. And he said, I have an urgent errand. My news is evil. Nazgul, he whispered, the Nine are abroad again. They've crossed the river secretly. Radagast is saying, we know what's going on. What do you mean? And Gandalf asked him, who told you and who sent you? Saruman the White, answered Radagast, and he told me to say that if you feel the need, he will help. But you must seek his aid at once or it will be too late. So Gandalf thinks he's relating this at the Council of Elrond, right? But it's backstory. And in the dream that Frodo has in Tom Bombadil's house, he sees this part of the story, right? So we have the correspondence in the timeline about when Gandalf was captured by Saruman. But he's only captured because Saruman sends out Radagast as bait, and Radagast, he's a master of shapes, changes of hue, much lore of herbs and beasts and birds. Whereas Saruman had studied, of course, the arts of the enemy, Sauron himself, and so Gandalf was he's wary, but not wary enough, as we learn in his retelling, and that Radagast is used unwittingly in this because he simply trusts Saruman to tell him the story. So Gandalf goes to Orthanc the first time, although this is reportage, right? We're not given to see it ourselves. And this is, of course, the great, in the movie, the scene where they get the great wizard battle and they're flung around the room and stuff like that. But that seems not to feature in this particular version. But it's a contest of something, right? So Gandalf says, when Saruman asked him, why are you here? The Nine have come forth again. I answered, they have crossed the river. So Radagast said to me, Radagast the Brown, laughed Saruman, and he no longer concealed his scorn. Radagast the bird tamer, Radagast the simple, Radagast the fool. Yet he had just the wit to play the part that I set him, for you have come, and that was all the purpose of my message. And here you will stay, Gandalf the Grey, and rest from journeys. For I am Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ringmaker, Saruman of Many Colours. Now, that's all, obviously, the wizard play is interesting. Tolkien gets very into the color imagery. Because Radagast being brown makes it sound like he's sort of simple and honest, right? And, okay, it only just occurred to me, but, and now it's wrong, so it's so obvious, right? I was trying to figure out why these colors for the wizard's robes, and one, they're cloaks, right? Tolkien loves the cloaks and the hoods and things like that. Well, the colors that they're wearing, except for black, which I'm not sure who would be wearing black. They're monastic colors, definitely. The blue ones, those are certain like Carmelite orders, and those would be women. So I don't think they're women. But white, brown, and gray, you have rather the Cistercians, the Franciscans, and the brown and gray. Okay, I'm playing that went too far, but the sense of their color imagery and their focus is out, because of their cunning and their wisdom, right? But Saruman doesn't want to just be white, right? He's now Saruman of Many Colours. And Gandalf says, I liked white better. White, Saruman sneered. It serves as a beginning. White cloth may be dyed. The white page can be overwritten. The white light can be broken. In which case, it is no longer white, said I. And he that breaks the thing to find out what it is have left the path of wisdom. At which Saruman makes his pitch to Gandalf, and Gandalf is unswayed by it. But obviously, consider what Saruman wants Gandalf to do, and it's curious because in this conversation, of course, what Saruman wants is to get the ring, the ruling ring, and get the power that comes from it. But there's only going to be one person who can wield the ring at a time. So why he's talking to Gandalf in this way in the first place is a little unclear. But he wants to get Gandalf it's like on his side, hard to say, claiming that the times are changing and now we can take over, right? The world of men which we must rule. And listen, Gandalf, my old friend and helper, he said, coming nearer and speaking now in a softer voice. I say we, for we it may be, if you will join with me. A new power is rising. Against it the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. What does this sound like, right? I've been talking about him as a wizard and as an incarnate angel and as a being of power, but consider the actual phrasing that Saruman is using as he's trying to ensnare Gandalf in his project, right? Against it, the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. There is no hope left in elves or dying Numenor. This, then, is one choice before you, before us. We may join with that power. It would be wise, Gandalf. There is hope that way. Its victory is at hand, and there will be rich reward for those that aided it. As the power grows, its proved friends will also grow, and the wise, such as you and I, may with patience come at last to direct its courses, to control it. We can bide our time. We can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring many evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose, knowledge, rule, order, all the things that we have so far striven in vain to accomplish, hindered rather than helped by our weak or idle friends. There would not be any real change in our designs, only in our means. Right, now Saruman it's like we're still the good guys, theoretically, right? What he wants is power, right? He's suggesting to Gandalf that we can assume this kind of power, and we need to change our alliances, right? The means are not good. Our old allies are not going to be valuable anymore, but this new power, if we serve with it, we may eventually be able to control it. I mean, he's being oblique, but he means Sauron, right? It's like a thing. It's like, fine, we can, if we ally ourselves with the evil to start with, well, eventually the power will come to us, and our ends, knowledge, rule, order, will come to us. We haven't been able to achieve them yet, but we'll be able to if we ally ourselves with this new rising powers. And Gandalf reports that he said to him, Saruman, I said, I have heard speeches of this kind before, but only in the mouths of emissaries sent from Mordor to deceive the ignorant. I cannot think that you brought me so far only to weary my ears. Well, of course Gandalf says, no, this isn't going to work because, in fact, you're promising the ring and only one hand at a time can wield it. But who makes these kinds of promises? Who speaks in this way? The multicolored, he's multicolored, and it's not as simple as diversity. Although that's very hard not to go. It's like in the 40s when Tolkien is writing this, the sort of rainbowness. There's a fragmentation and a loss. Is it a loss of innocence, a loss of purity, a loss of simplicity, a loss of purpose? But Saruman, by now his robe being all colors, wants to be all things rather than serving the purpose that he was originally sent for, possibly, right? It's interesting that at this point the only way Gandalf gets away is because he's rescued by the eagle, right? Gwaihir, the evil from the tower. So we have, the eagles are also the kind of angelic. They have this kind of angel. One, they actually can fly, but they swoop in and fix things that you think, well, why didn't you just drop Frodo and Sam at the volcano in the first place? The eagles especially help Gandalf twice, right? One, that Gwaihir finds him at Orthanc, and he also finds him when he's been recovered after the fall from in Moria. So Gandalf is very closely associated with a far-sighted bird. Eagles are also, if you go to the Christian layering that's possibly here with the Gospel of St. John, right? The aim of the beginning was the Word. That John in the evangelical creatures is seen as the eagle who sees God most clearly. They're the birds of Manwë, the eagles of the lords of the West, right? The eagle imagery is very, very powerful here. It's, used only occasionally, but like Gandalf, I think is probably, playing it more. And you think about, maybe the eagles, if they're bald eagles, they're white and brown. Keep thinking about that color imagery, right? Okay, so Saruman wants to convince himself that even though he was sent to help the creatures of Middle-earth, not to assume power himself, that he can do better in his original mission, theoretically, if he first allies with the enemy that he was sought to fight. Okay, well, we know that when Gandalf comes back and Legolas and Gimli and Aragorn meet with him, then you obviously need to know the story, but Legolas and Gimli and Aragorn meet with Gandalf by Fangorn, and they go to Meduseld and help Theoden get out of Grima Wormtongue's grip. And Grima has been, of course, working with Saruman. You can consider the kinds of power that Grima has had over Theoden. It's a extension of Saruman's ability. But when the three companions first meet up with Gandalf, they're not sure who he is because he's not wearing gray anymore. He's wearing white, and they're saying, how are you yourself? How are you Gandalf? And he says, yes, I am white now, said Gandalf. Indeed, I am Saruman. One might almost say Saruman as he should have been. But come now, tell me of yourself. So he is, because they're angels, because they're these kinds of embodied spirits, that Gandalf can take the role that Saruman was supposed to have, since Saruman has fallen out of it. And therefore, by the time Gandalf, now white, shows up at Orthanc the second time to contest with Saruman in the scene that we had at the beginning, that we're returning to by way of understanding all of these creatures, it's Saruman addressing himself, as it were. It's the Saruman, Gandalf as Saruman, as the white as he should have been, versus Saruman, the multicolored, the many-colored, as he has been when he has fallen. So what is the nature of his fall, and what is the nature of the power that he should have had? Well, we find him, of course, at Orthanc, and we don't have a full description of Orthanc until it's Isengard has in fact been devastated by the Ents, but that the Orthanc itself is the tower in the ring of Isengard, and it was not in fact built by Saruman, but was built by the Númenóreans, right, the men of Westerness. And Saruman has repurposed Orthanc for his own devices, definitely. So whereas it had been a garden with many trees and such, now we have simply flagstones and pillars, some of marble, some of copper, and some of iron, joined by heavy chains. I told you I've been listening to a lot of Owen's live streams, and he's been talking a lot about these buildings that we have, particularly in North America, but you can see them all around the world, of saying the Tartarians, right? These great constructions of men of the ancient past. I'm very interested by that, the persistence of that incredulity that we have about great works of architecture and powers. But clearly Orthanc is, it's not as such an obelisk. We do have one of Tolkien's drawings of it, right? And it's a jagged. It's not smooth-sided, right? It's spiky. He didn't like the spiky towers, but there is since it's very obelisk-like in this circle, and now with all of these chained pillars going towards it. The movie obviously does a nice job of showing you that imagery. And it's all filled now with these passages and factories and such. The tower is marvelous shape. It was fashioned by the builders of old who smoothed the ring of Isengard, and yet it seemed a thing not made by the craft of men, but riven from the bones of the earth and the ancient torment of the hills. A peak and isle of rock it was, black and gleaming hard. 4 mighty piers of many-sided stone were welded into one, but near the summit they opened into gaping horns, their pinnacles sharp as the points of spears, keen-edged as knives. Between them was a narrow space, and there upon a floor of polished stone, written with strange signs, a man might stand 500 feet above the plain. This was Orthanc, the citadel of Saruman, the name of which had, by design or chance, design and chance have this interesting tension for Tolkien. Is it luck or is it purpose? Luck or purpose? Well, which is it, right? How much of the story is happening because it's planned ahead, and how much of it is good luck, right? Want to have a longer think about that too. A twofold meaning. For in the Elvish speech, Orthanc signifies Mount Fang, but in the language of the Mark of old, that is Rohan, which is therefore close to Old English, the cunning mind. Now that's interesting because Saruman, he's got these multiple names, right? Cuanir, which is the Sindarin name, Kuromo probably in Kenya, but Saruman is one of those. It can come from an Anglo-Saxon understanding of saru, skill, right? Cunning device, and he set himself up in Orthanc, which we're told in Rohirrim means cunning mind. So the cunningness, right? There's this. He's the man of skill. He's the man of cunning. He's the man of devices and design. Now opposed by his, and to have him set in that tower, fixed in the earth, where he's going to well, we know what he does is he sends out a great army of orcs that he's made from it, but that, and he's also obviously always, when the Ints come up against him, that he's the image obviously of industry and devices, but his true power is this cunningness, right? And in the appendices is described as they have many powers of mind and hand. So if you're worrying about the mark of the beast on your hand and your mind, your thoughts, and your deeds, right? And he's definitely got both of those bound up. Okay, we're ready now. What kind of voice is Saruman? And what does his fall teach us? So as Gandalf is leading the company up to the tower, Gimli at first, and saying at the beginning of this episode we were reading, say Gimli's muttering like and yet unlike. Gimli specifically wanted to come because he wanted to. Gandalf has told them, I am Saruman now. I am Saruman as he should have been. I am Saruman. I am Gandalf the White. The White, this is what the White should have been instead of what Saruman tried to become. And Gimli wants to know whether he can tell the difference between the two. That they're going to look very similar, and that he mutters like and yet unlike. Gandalf looks like Saruman now, but he's also Saruman as Saruman should have been. And Gandalf says, and how will you learn that, Master Dwarf? Whether they're the same or not. Gimli had said, I wish to see him and learn if he really looks like you. And how will you learn that, Master Dwarf, said Gandalf. Saruman could look like me in your eyes, if it suited his purposes with you. Are you yet wise enough to detect all his counterfeits? We shall see, perhaps. So there's Saruman can cast illusions of himself, but that seems this sort of, what is his greatest power? Well, Pippin wonders, right? What's the danger? Will he shoot at us and pour fire out of the windows? or can he put a spell on us from the distance? The last is most likely, if you ride to his door with a light heart, said Gandalf. There is no knowing what he can do or may choose to try. A wild beast cornered is not safe to approach, and Saruman has powers you do not guess. Beware of his voice. Now, we are all in a period, we're in a day. I kind of wonder what's happening right now as I'm recording, right? What changes in the world have been wrought with voices? We are in a moment in human history when the power of the voice is magnified, amplified, hard to trust, right? How many of you have spent ever so long now wondering whether anything that you see on these magical boxes that we're talking on can be trusted, but recognizing that some of it's just the images, right? And I've talked in previous episodes about the power of the palantir, the far seeing, right? And at the end of this scene, right, what we have is Grima throws the palantir down, trying to hit somebody, and of course Saruman doesn't want him to do that. But Saruman's power in person is this capacity to do what, right? And that actually does matter a great deal. Exactly what kind of power is this spell that he's potentially going to bring everybody under? Well, first we had his voice is very soft and very endearing, and you can say he just seems like a kindly old man, right? But in fact, he addresses himself first to Theoden, and we know through Grima, Wormtongue, right? Saruman has had immense control over Theoden for some time, and now Theoden he's cast off the enchainment that he had from Wormtongue, but can he resist it still, right? And here, at first, when Saruman speaks to him, we're not sure, right? He says, "O worthy son of Thingol, the thrice renowned, why have you not come before, and as a friend? Much have I desired to see you, mightiest king of western lands, and especially in these latter years, to save you from the unwise and evil counsels that beset you. Is it yet too late?" And so this is the sort of soft, he honors him, he calls him mighty, he says we're friends, and as Theoden is listening, all of the men of Rohan can hear this voice too, and the writers are at first spellbound. They are too silent as men, spellbound. What is the spell? What is the word magic that Saruman is able to project? It seemed to them that Gandalf had never spoken so fair and fittingly to their lord. Rough and proud now seemed all his dealings with Theoden. That because Saruman is able to speak with this courtesy, the writers, having encountered Gandalf when he comes to rescue Theoden from Grima, and now ridden with him in battle and showing up, they're still capable of being enchanted by Saruman's pretty words, right? And everyone starts despairing, right? There's a heavy silence. But it was Gimli, the dwarf, who broke in suddenly. "The words of this withered stand on their heads," he growled, in the language of Orthanc. "Help means ruin, and saving means slaying, that is plain. But we do not come here to beg." Gimli, interestingly, right now is able to see how Saruman is using words. It's like he's the many colors, right? So he's going to be shifting. It's like you can't tell exactly which word you can trust because it's all inverting, right? It's so interesting, the many colors here as opposed to the one not color. I mean, white is white a color or not, right? It's white is pure light, right? It's the not the fractured light of the prism, but the focused light that Gandalf is saying Saruman should have been. Because Saruman can shift all the time, he can invert words, he can invert meaning, and Gimli calls him out on this. Help means ruin, and saving means slain, that is plain. And then Saruman says peace, right? So we have okay, I'll tell you, he's a politician, obviously, but Tolkien is writing in a time when clear, never mind whether it's the atomic bomb or Hitler or atomic bomb or Nazis or something like that, the power of persuasion is uppermost in his mind, right? He's very, very worried about, Tolkien is worried and showing us through the Saruman character what kinds of things mere words can do, right? Saruman does nothing. He doesn't throw, I mean, the only sort of quote violence that happens is when Grima throws the Palantir out the window at the end, right? After everybody's broken the spell. The great power that Saruman has is his wordcraft, right? The cunning of his mind. It's his rhetoric, right? And if you think about what do we want wizards to be, and going back to the scene that they put in the movie with Saruman trying to persuade Gandalf to come, ally with him, but clearly somehow Saruman thinks he needs either control, whatever, right? What Jackson does in the movie, what he needed to have happen in the movie was a giant battle with them, flinging each other against the walls and stuff. It's very, very physical. Tolkien almost never has actual physical battles, and he's not very good at describing the ones that he does give you, right? They're very metonymic. He ends up with the sword underroll, swish 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 swish. He's like the weapons do all the work, and it's very hard to see it actually in Tolkien's narration that the characters are doing the fighting. But here we have this duel, right? We're having a very important duel between Gandalf and Saruman. It happens solely through speech, right? Even with the incarnation of the word, the power, the great power that Saruman has is not flinging thunderbolts and not, spells that paralyze you or, make you fall dead or something like that. It's on the power of getting you to consent, right? That everything, that's why Saruman had to get Radagast to bring Gandalf to Orthanc, because he needed Gandalf to go along with him willingly. Now let's go back to what Tolkien said about the Istari as messengers, and what power is to Gandalf Tolkien, right? What power is to Tolkien is dominating other wills and minds. And that's, of course, what Saruman was saying to Gandalf in the earlier scene at Orthanc, that he wanted to do was, participate in this new rising power. But in Tolkien's understanding, the greatest power you have is not over people's bodies, right? It's not, in this sense, forcing them in some way to do things with their bodies against their will. It's capturing their wills and it's not dominating them with their own consent. Now, I think this this should be a very topical theme for all you bears, that we are only slaves to the political powers insofar as we consent to the things that they're persuading us to try to believe, right? And Tolkien is trying to show you this, that the way it happens, the voice of Saruman is a pure, it's like distilled demonstration of how a politician can be speaking, and people in the audience could hear completely different things depending on how he's directing his persuasion, but that everything depends upon the ability for his voice to convince his hearers. And that's why the writers, when they're listening to Saruman speak to Theoden, think, oh wow, Gandalf, he's always like really rude and here Saruman, he speaks so I have no idea whatsoever anybody who might have been described as, speaking brutishly for the past 4 years as our president, who's still our president as I'm recording this. And that is what it's like. The writers are listening to Saruman speak so beautifully and graciously, and they're not hearing his words, which Gimli for some reason can hear, saying, no, he's speaking everything inverted, he's speaking everything backwards. At which point, of course, Saruman gets angry. Peace, said Saruman, and for a fleeting moment his voice was less suave, and a light flickered in his eyes and was gone. I do not speak to you yet, Gimli Gloin's son. Far away is your home, and by small concern of yours are the troubles of this land. But it was not by design of your own that you became embroiled in them, so I will not blame such a part as you have played. A valiant one, I doubt not. But I pray you, allow me first to speak with the king of Rohan, my neighborhood, and once my friend. So he's still, it's like, there underneath Saruman's true weakness is if you don't believe him, right? If you don't believe this persuasion that he's trying to effect, if you don't believe his rhetoric, and when Gimli can hear through it, and see, as the writers are starting to perceive Gandalf as crude and Gandalf never spoke nicely to our Lord, and Gimli can see that, but Theoden is still sort of apparently potentially trapped. Éomer says, how, come on, are we here now? Have we ridden forth to victory only to stand at last amazed by an old liar? With honey on his forked tongue, so would the trapped wolf speak to the hounds if he could. What aid can he give you, forsooth? And then Saruman turns on Éomer. Each of them, it's like Saruman is directing his persuasion at one person at a time, but he seems like he can only do one at a time because, and I think this is important, because each of us is going to be enchanted by a different kind of argument. And Gandalf has warned everyone, as you're listening, beware, right? His voice is greatly powerful, but what we are seeing is how the different listeners hear slightly different things, and so they can say, no, don't be caught. So Saruman, again, he's getting angry. If we speak with poisoned tongues, what should we say of yours, young serpent? And then he shifts, right? So you can see the anger as he has to shift focus, and then but now Éomer, right? To every man his part. Valor in arms is yours, and you win high honor thereby. Slay whom your lord names as enemies, and be content. Meddle not in policies which you do not understand. But maybe if you become a king, you will find that he must choose his friends with care. There's again the same kind of argument that Saruman made with Gandalf earlier about, we need to ally ourselves, and maybe even if we're allying ourselves with the our previous enemy, but that's good for our purposes because in the long run he's the political speech of convenient allies and necessary friendships, and Tolkien is never so cliched as saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but Saruman is playing out that you don't be so you're too low to know in fact who's really in power, which is definitely the way a lot of us are feeling right now, right? It's like at what level are you able to see whose counsels are actually commanding the outcome? And the irony of this for Tolkien, of course, is Saruman thinks he's up at the top, and obviously with the Palantir, Sauron has been deceiving him, but he's been trying to deceive Sauron. Who's actually in charge? Design or chance, but he look at the kinds of arguments that he's done with courtesy, and he's already talking about peace, and now he says, well, you think I'm a murderer? You kill people in battle. Am I to be called a murderer because valiant men have fallen in battle? If you go to war needlessly, for I did not desire it, then men will be slain. It's like Saruman claiming that Éomer started it. If I am a murderer on that account, then all the house of Earl is stained with murder, for they have fought many wars. So here, the tension between, and Tolkien is wrestling with this, and we will talk through this, sort of the purpose of war and the problem of war, that Saruman is always willing to send, those orcs that he basically manufactured, if we say, or bred, or however he made them, into battle and have them all killed. Saruman does not care for his individual soldiers. He's not a lord who has loyal servants. He has servants that he is well persuaded. In what sense? That he's using the kinds of arguments that people typically do to twist the truth of the situation, right? Theoden finally snaps out of it and says, "We will have peace. But you are a liar, Saruman, and a corrupter of men's hearts. You hold out your hand to me, and I perceive only a finger of the claw of Mordor, cruel and cold. Even if your war on me was just, as it was not, for you were you 10 times as wise, you would have no right to rule me, and mine for your own profit as you desired. Even so, what will you save your torches in Westfold and the children that lie dead there?" So Theoden he finally snaps out of it, and he's able to make the proper argument, saying, even if your war was just, you still don't have the right to rule over me and mine for your own profit. Tolkien, of course, yes, and as I'm talking now, I'm thinking of all the different episodes to come, because there are always going to be more episodes to come. We always end this with "to be continued." But here we have Tolkien wrestling with his political theory, or his political theology. His primary one being the sort of local rule, right? He's what Saruman is in image is this sort of desire for totalitarianism that Sauron is ultimately, yes, but Saruman was trying to convince Gandalf to participate in. We may need bad methods, but our end is good. And Theoden is saying, well, no, even if your cause was just, even if what you were trying to do had just cause, you don't have just cause in trying to rule over me and mine. That always that problem of domination and coercive authority is a problem. But again, the only way Saruman was able to do that with Theoden in the first place was to send Grima to him and try to convince him of things, right? So this coercive power over his will. But Theoden is snapped out of it. He says, "I fear your voice has lost its charm." The riders gazed up at Theoden like men startled out of a dream. All of the Rohirrim listening to this conversation they've snapped out of it when Theoden is able to snap out of it and saying the power that this kind of globalizing language. Saruman is clearly in a tower, right? And he's trying to convince everyone to go along with his, in effect, globalizing ambitions. And it takes Theoden as his neighbor to resist that persuasion. Harsh as an old raven's, their master's voice sounded in their ears after the music of Saruman. But Saruman for a while was beside himself with wrath. He leaned over the rail as if he would smite the king with his staff. To some, it suddenly seemed they saw a snake coiling itself to strike. Now this is Saruman revealing his true desires, which are serpentine, which are therefore like the snake. He's made a garden. His Orthanc Tower is in what had been a garden. He's turned it into a factory. But you see the snake who has been trying with his persuasion to bring people under his plan, has no power over them as long as they can hear it for what it actually is. And then all he can say, "Gibbets and crows," he hissed, and they shuddered at the hideous change. He flips and they can see it, but just for a moment, and then he insults Theoden, right? So you realize it's flattery and apparent logic But what he really thinks of Theoden, brats roll, dotard, what is the house of Earl, but a thatched barn where brigands drink in the reek, and their brats roll on the floor among the dogs. So, you just have children lying around with your puppies. That everything that Saruman depends on is illusory. And he absolutely depends on making other people doubt themselves by saying, you're trash, right? And now he carries on with his insults of Theoden. But now he tries it again on Gandalf. And what's interesting is even though the writers have been snapped out of the spell when Saruman was talking to Theoden, the spell can still work again, and the second version of it is equally interesting. So now he tries it on Gandalf and says, "How comes it that you can endure such company? For you are proud, Gandalf, and not without reason, having a noble mind and eyes that look both deep and far." And Gandalf is sort of say, "Well, okay, what else do you have to say to me? Maybe you have things to unsay." And Saruman paused. "Unsay," he mused, as if puzzled. "Unsay? I endeavored to advise you for your own good, but you scarcely listened. You are proud and do not love advice." Talk about projecting, right? That Saruman is using his own sense of what power actually means to try to insult Gandalf. "Well, you're proud, and you wouldn't listen to my advice, having indeed a store of your own wisdom. But on that occasion you erred, I think, misconstruing my intentions willfully. I fear that in my eagerness to persuade you, I lost patience." And we said that that's what Tolkien says the great temptation for the Istari was to become impatient, leading to the desire to force others to their own good ends. And so we have Saruman confessing that, yes, I felt impatient, I tried to force you, and indeed I regret it. So but he's not really apologizing, and he's certainly not changing his intentions. He's simply, you watch him trying to now act on Gandalf, and what he appeals to first, he appealed for Theoden. He appeals to Theoden's desire to have honor and have his house be considered both virtuous, I think, in just wars, but also magnificent, right? I can't find the right words, but now Saruman he's trying this on. Interesting. I can't find the right words. I'm talking about Saruman finding the right words to try to trap people, right? He plays off of what he thinks is going to be Gandalf's desire to be a peer with him, right? "Are we not both members of a high and ancient order, most excellent in Middle Earth? Our friendship would profit us both alike." Profit is obviously a purposeful term there for Tolkien. Much we could still accomplish together to heal the disorders of the world." Look at the temptation that Saruman is offering Gandalf. We are the elite, our order. We are the members of a high and ancient order. I mean, I doubt very much that Tolkien means them to be Freemasons or something like that. But that massive temptation of those with enormous, whatever it is, power. I mean, we're trying to understand power here, and Tolkien has said in his world, power means dominating other wills and minds, right? It's coercing their bodies. Doesn't seem to need to do that much. The real sort of, savor. I think it's like preciousness, flavor, savor. It's like what Saruman wants most is this control, this control other people's free will, and he's trying to do it to Gandalf as well by way of promising that we could heal the disorders of the world. Remember what he wanted when he first talked to Gandalf? It was knowledge and order, right? "Let us understand one another and dismiss from thought these lesser folk. Let them wait on our decisions. For the common good, I am willing to redress the past and to receive you Will you not consult with me? Will you not come up? So great was the power that Saruman exerted in this last effort that none that stood within hearing were unmoved. But now the spell was wholly different. They heard the gentle remonstrance of a kindly king with an erring but much loved minister. But they were shut out, listening at a door to words not meant for them, ill-mannered children or stupid servants, overhearing the elusive discourse of their elders and wondering how it would affect their lot. Of loftier mold these two were made, reverent and wise. It was inevitable that they should make alliance. Gandalf would ascend into the tower to discuss deep things beyond their comprehension in the high chambers of Orthanc. The door would be closed, and they would be left outside, dismissed to await allotted work or punishment. Even in the mind of Theoden, the thought took shape like a shadow of doubt. He will betray us. He will go. We shall be lost. What does Gandalf do? I think it's like, how do you defeat this kind of enchantment? How do you defeat this? Everyone listening, I mean, from the hobbits to the, Gimli maybe, or the premise now is everyone, even Theoden, is not sure that Gandalf is not going to betray them and go up and, in fact, make cause with Saruman and destroy everything. What does Gandalf do? He laughed. Then Gandalf laughed. The fantasy vanished like a puff of smoke. The joy of his laughter is what just snaps everyone out of Saruman's spell again, right? Gandalf laughed. Saruman has been getting progressively angrier and angrier, right? And the snake comes out, and everybody's like, Gandalf laughs. I think that's the wonderful, wonderful moment in the scene. Gandalf laughed. The fantasy vanished like a puff of smoke. Saruman, Saruman, said Gandalf, still laughing. Saruman, you missed your path in life. You should have been the king's jester, and earned your bread and stripes, too, by mimicking his counselors. Ah, me, he paused, getting the better of it. Understand one another? I fear I am beyond your comprehension. The stripes are the reference to the devils often wearing stripes, and the stripe clothing was considered that's a devil's fabric in the Middle Ages, right? So here, Gandalf laughs at Saruman, and Saruman should have played the jester, the fool, and this is, of course, what makes Saruman crack eventually. It's like the mask slips, and all they see is his doubt, right? They saw through the mask the anguish of a mind in doubt, loathing to stay and dreading to leave its refuge. When Gandalf invites him down, will I come down? No. And he ends up finally enraged, right? Because what Gandalf doesn't need to overpower Saruman. That's what's so, one, by now he has assumed what Saruman should have been in the first place. Saruman has, by way of his machinations and his desires to have power and his desire to control, lost all the power that he had. But no, the company can't see that until Gandalf laughs at him, right? Until he the joy wells up. Remember, Gandalf is he's encouragement, right? He's meant to kindle hearts when they are chilled by the despair, like, and what Saruman has been trying to do is make them lose hope that they can't do anything without him. And Gandalf simply says, you don't understand me. What shall you do? You should just come down and let go away, right? And Gandalf explains to Saruman he can leave if he just go free, right? And Saruman says, no, I'm not going to do that. And he's enraged. And at this point now, Gandalf does exercise his own true power when Saruman refuses and says, his face grew livid, twisted with rage. A red light was kindled in his eyes. I'm not going to do this. Later, yes, when you also have the keys of Barad-dûr itself, I suppose, in the Crown of Seven Kings, that the only thing that Saruman can think Gandalf wants is the same kind of power that he wanted. And you see the limitation of Saruman's cunning, that the only thing he can see anybody is going to want is exactly the same kind of power to control other minds that he wanted. And he projects all of that onto Gandalf. All that he can see. When Gandalf has laughed, said, "You don't have any power over me, and won't you come down?" Right? Saruman had been inviting Gandalf up to come up in the tower, and Gandalf is saying, "No, no, no, you should come down and go free." Right? If you can actually come down out of your tower, you will be free to go. And that's what. And Saruman doesn't believe it's like their conditions. Why are you going to let me go? "Come back, Saruman," said Gandalf in a commanding voice. To the amazement of the others, Saruman turned around as if dragged against his will. He came back slowly to the iron rail, leaning on it, breathing hard. His face was lined and shrunken. His hand clutched his heavy black staff like a claw. And at this point, Gandalf is going to exercise his power over Saruman, his authority, which he has. He's given Saruman the chance to give up his fantasies of becoming the sort of power that he wanted to. But Gandalf says now, "You have become a fool, Saruman, and yet pitiable. You might still have turned away from folly and evil and have been of service. But you choose to stay and gnaw the ends of your old plots. Stay then, but I warn you, you will not come easily out again. Not unless the dark hands of the east stretch out to take you. Saruman," he cried, and his voice grew in power and authority. "Behold, I am not Gandalf the Grey, whom you betrayed. I am Gandalf the White, who has returned from death. You have no color now, and I cast you from the Order and from the Council." That Saruman, in trying to be more than the color that he had been given, going beyond the role that he had been given by whoever sent the Lords of the West that sent him, ends up with no color, and Gandalf also, his staff also breaks, right? So it's interesting, and I do want to think more about this color imagery and the white and the many colored, that Saruman, in trying to be all colors, becomes no color, and in trying to dominate all other wills, in fact becomes miserable and ridiculous and pitiable. Now, in fact, it does happen that Saruman gets away, and in the epilogue, of course, we have him in there in the Shire as Sharky, right? As he says, this is another of his names, what the orcs called him, Sharku, old man. That by that point, the hobbits are able to resist Saruman's power. Not the hobbits in the Shire, but the hobbits who've been obviously with Gandalf and Frodo and Sam. And even then, Frodo refuses to kill Saruman. That it's not the hobbits who kill Saruman, but in fact Wormtongue. And when Saruman is stabbed by Wormtongue, he kills him as it were like a dog, and Saruman sort of a mist goes away, right? To the dismay of those that stood by about the body of Saruman, a gray mist gathered, and rising slowly to a great height like smoke from a fire, as a pale shrouded figure it loomed over the hill. For a moment it wavered, looking to the west, but out of the west came a cold wind, and it bent away, and with a sigh dissolved into nothing. So, I mean, it's interesting that Saruman, the cunning mind, is in the end killed by the Wormtongue. The cunning that Saruman tried to affect and to assert over all of these other wills is killed by his own servant, the lying tongue, that's I think Tolkien getting it moderately close to allegory, but and it's interesting that he looked to the west, or the gray mist looks to the west, as if what. I mean, over and over and over again, Saruman has been shown mercy by Gandalf and then the hobbits, but he can't give mercy himself. So what was the power of his voice, and what was the cause of his fall? We have enough pieces here to be able to answer that. Well, interestingly, this is in talking about the way in which Saruman is portrayed in the movie, in the sort of, you know, physical battles that Jackson gives the wizards as opposed to the mind battle that Tolkien is giving. There was a movie treatment sketched out. This is a letter from June 1958. So he's responding to a movie treatment, and there's ways in which the scriptwriter or the treatment writer is trying to imagine these characters. Including, for example, you know, imagining the tower, right? The spiral staircase weaving around the tower comes from Z's fancy, not my tale. I prefer the latter, his own, right? The tower was 500 feet high. There was a flight of 27 steps leading to the great door above, which was a window and a balcony. So stop adding spiral staircases around. But that's not the thing that really bothers him. What definitely bothers him is the way the script writer, or the treatment writer, I don't know how to say that. It's a film treatment. They're trying to like plot it out as a storyboard it out, I suppose, as a movie. But he's very particular about what he sees, the mistake that the treatment writer is making about Saruman's power. He says, Z is altogether too fond of the words hypnosis and hypnotic. Right? You've been wondering about, it's like, what did Saruman do to all of those people that were listening to him? And, you know, it's like that spell that he's casting over them. Oh, well, he's hypnotized them. And Tolkien says, no. No, it's not hypnosis. Neither genuine hypnosis nor scientific fictitious variants occur in my tale. There's no hypnosis. Saruman's power is not hypnotic. Saruman's voice, he says, was not hypnotic, but persuasive, right? And you think it persuasive, right? Those who listened to him were not in danger of falling into a trance, but of agreeing with his arguments while fully awake. It was always open to one to reject by free will and reason both his voice while speaking and its after impressions. Saruman corrupted the reasoning powers. Now that, I think, is like, this is so amazingly powerful, because all of the things that Tolkien has been, you know, describing about the effects of his voice, and it's a spell and it's enchantment, you think, oh, it's, you know, it's hypnotic. It's like, he's saying, absolutely not. It's a corruption of the reason. Saruman was, you know, he's the, how do we say that? His name is you know, derives from this man of cunning, right? He's the man of cunning. So, man of skill, man of cunning, right? The Saru, skill, cunning, right? And that just as he makes devices, machines, and so forth when he takes over Isengard, he makes devices of the mind. That this is a rhetorical power, but it's a persuasion that acts on the reason, and therefore you are able to resist it. Therefore, it only works insofar as you consent to it. There's no, that's what's very, very interesting for the way Tolkien is imagining this. It's not a compulsion that is involuntary, that you can, you know, you have to fight and resist because it's trying to take you over. It is working on, remember that Tolkien said the Istari are sent to help the creatures, the rational creatures. And so the great corruption, the great fall of Saruman is falling. I mean, you could say he's falling into his own devices, right? He's falling into his own ability to think that he can figure everything out himself, right? He wants knowledge and order, and that's what he promises Gandalf. So his fall is, this is, it in the Two Towers, the opposites are the Orthanc, the Tower of Cunning, right, and Shelob, where the Minas Morgul, where Shelob is, right, the bodily appetites. Saruman is a perversion of the desire to have knowledge, the desire for will and control, right? He is, it's like literally the perfect example of this desire for, and he even says it when he's talking to Gandalf that second time. To heal the disorders of the world for the common good, right? He's making all of these kinds of arguments that we're constantly hearing from our politicians and the elite of some sort, one way or the other, that they are going to, control us and take care of us for our own good. And the only power, Tolkien is insisting on this, you're not hypnotized. The only power that Saruman and the voice of Saruman has is persuasion. It's his rhetoric, which is a very fascinating thought to have this day, January 6th, 2021, as we are engaged in the great political rhetoric. So it's probably one of the great battles of political rhetoric, greatest battle of political rhetoric that our country has seen, well, in some time. I doubt it's absolutely new. I will be very interested to what's going to happen on the day that this video actually airs, by design or by chance. We don't know. Tolkien wrote a little poem. I'll finish with a little poem about the Istari that I think is a nice coda for us. Wilt thou learn the lore that was long secret of the 5 that came from a far country? Only one returned, others never again. Under men's dominion Middle Earth shall seek, until Dagor Dagorath and the doom cometh. How hast thou heard it, the hidden counsel of the lords of the west in the land of Aman? The long roads are lost that led thither, and to mortal men Manwë speaks not. From the west that was, a wind bore it to the sleeper's ear in the silences under night's shadow, when news is brought from lands forgotten in lost ages, over seas of year to the searching thought. Not all are forgotten by the elder king. Sauron he saw as a slow menace. The Valor may not speak, but they sent their messengers, only with the power to persuade, not control. We'll leave you with that thought, and considering exactly what kinds of spells we find ourselves under and which ones we need to be like the writers of Rohan or the hobbits and recognize are working on us when they don't need to. To be continued.